Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's film in our series about the great political films is The Candidate, released in 1972, starring Robert Redford, a great film about what it's like to run for high political office. And I'm talking about it with the longtime politician Chris Smith, now Lord Smith of Finsbury. He was for 21 years the MP for Islington South, and he served for 4 years in Tony Blair's cabinet as the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. This is a conversation about politics as seen on film, but also about what politics is like as seen from the inside. Chris, this film, The Candidate, came out in 1972, and in many ways it is a film of its era. I watched it for the first time recently, so I watched it 50 years after the event. Can you remember when you first saw it and how it struck you the first time you saw it? And where were you in your own political journey, if I can put it like that?
I'm pretty sure that I saw it fairly shortly after it had come out. So mid-1970s, I was just finishing as a research student. I was heading off to Harvard for a year. I threw myself during my year at Harvard into the presidential election primary campaigns of 1976. And it had an enormous amount of resonance for me then. It is a dated film now. You need to get over the enormous surprise of the fact that a Republican could be a 3-term senator for California. But apart from some of the dated bits of it, it is still, I think, enormously relevant.
When you saw it in the 70s, were you by that point thinking of a career in politics yourself, or were you just on the sort of research end of this, getting involved in campaigns, or were you thinking about the possibility that you might one day yourself be a campaigner, in the sense this is a film about a campaign?
I was certainly thinking about a life in politics. I had a passion for wanting to change the world, and I thought at that time that a life in politics was the way in which you could best go about bringing about change. And this film, of course, questions that, and it made me question that, but I was still determined to get stuck in and to try and make a political career for myself.
And when you were involved in those 76 primaries, so that's Jimmy Carter, and that's the Jimmy Carter-Gerald Ford election. Where and for whom were you campaigning?
I was campaigning for Mo Udall, who was a congressman from Arizona, and his brother, Stuart Udall, ended up becoming Secretary of State for the Interior, I think under either Clinton or Obama. But I had been to see all the Democratic candidates. One of the advantages of being at Harvard was they all came to do a talk and answer questions from students at Harvard. And I went to listen to them all. I wasn't, I have to say, particularly impressed by Jimmy Carter. I certainly didn't want to vote for Henry Jackson or campaign for Henry Jackson. And Mo Udall was an enormously attractive candidate. I campaigned for him in New Hampshire in the primary there. I campaigned for him in the primary in Massachusetts. He came second everywhere. And I can remember being very struck by the fact that in the UK, and I'd been heavily involved in city council campaigning in Cambridge, I was very struck by the fact that in the UK, the political battles were about ideas. whereas in the US, the political battles were about personalities. Now, that has now changed on both sides of the Atlantic, but I think the US were far ahead of the UK at that time in the personalization of political contests.
And in a way, that is part of the story of the film, The Candidate. So to let people know what it's about a young guy played by Robert Redford, good looking. And it is part of the story that he is good looking. He looks good on TV. He looks good off TV, to be honest. And a political operative, a Democratic Party political operative, identifies him as a potential outsider candidate to take on the incumbent Republican for this Californian Senate seat. So like you say, you have to think of California 50 plus years ago as being a place where Republicans might be the incumbents, have a sort of stronghold there. And to start with, the Robert Redford character is wary. And part of the reason he's wary is he is an idealist. He's a campaigning lawyer, and he's very wary of getting caught up in a campaign which he suspects is going to trivialize his ideas and focus on some of the superficial aspects of politics. So when you saw it, and seeing it as someone whose involvement in politics had been British to that point, before you then in 76 did the campaigning in the States, did it strike you as surprising? Did it strike you as cynical, the way in which this film basically shows a man being stripped of his ideas and his ideals in the pursuit of office?
It's a film that, more than anything else, explores the clash between ideals and grubby reality in political campaigning. And that is something that I think has taught me a lesson throughout my political career. And it is undoubtedly the case also here in the UK and in any attempt to operate in government in the UK. In the film, you see his idealism at the outset gets transposed over time into a sort of mush that is there to be unfrightening to the electorate. And that, I fear, happens an awful lot in political campaigning. There are two moments when his idealism still surges through and he abandons the mush. One moment is when he's doing a direct debate with his Republican incumbent opponent, and through the entire debate, he keeps to the script that he's been given by the political operatives around him. But then suddenly at the end, when they're supposed to give concluding remarks, he abandons his script and he passionately says what he believes. And he says, there are things here that we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about poverty. We haven't talked about race. And those are the things that this election ought to be all about. And it's as if he can't help himself to say that. And that's the idealism powering through. And there's another moment where he's meeting a shady union operative from the Teamsters, and the guy who is the leader of the Teamsters offers him his support and says, there's an awful lot we have in common. And Bill McKay, the Robert Redford character, turns around and says, I don't think we've got shit in common. And that's another moment when the idealism really comes through. And one of the most profoundly impactful books that I've ever read was an account of Franklin Roosevelt in the White House through the 1930s and into the Second World War. And it's called No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And now Franklin Roosevelt is one of my great heroes. He transformed America and American politics. He did so much. And yet, through the course of his time in the White House, looking at what was happening week by week by week, you see that he's doing deals, he's making compromises, he's settling for half of what he wants because it's better than nothing. And that is the whole process of politics and government in a nutshell. You are always having to do deals to settle for less than the ideals that you still, I hope, hold fast to. But by doing that, you make small steps of change, and that is, one hopes, change for the better. And you always have to keep the ideals in front of you, but know that you are never, ever going to achieve everything that you would really like to.
One of the things this film suggests is that this campaign for Bill Mackay, the Robert Redford character, it's an education in politics. And we'll come on to some of the things that he learns. But I thought one of the things that was so interesting about those moments where his idealism breaks through is they tend to be connected with a kind of self-disgust. So that scene you described where he meets the Teamster boss and he arrives at the meeting late and without even being implied, it's almost explicit, but not quite spelled out. He's late because he's been in bed with the woman he's now having an affair with on the campaign trail. At the start of the campaign, we see him with his wife, and his wife encourages him to run. By the end, it's clear their marriage is in trouble, and the film ends with a scene where there's a real bleakness between them. But he arrives at that meeting late, and it almost feels like his principal stand against this guy in order to say, I'm not like you, is because he's already learned that he is a bit like the people that he loathed because the campaign has more or less corrupted him at this point. I mean, it hasn't corrupted his ideals, but it's corrupted him as a person. And even in that debate, he breaks because the pretense of keeping up the on-message, don't frighten the horses politics leaves him with a kind of self-loathing. So I don't know whether that rings true with your own experiences of campaigning. But what's great about this film, in a way, is that it never gives you anything kind of pure and untrammeled. Idealism in this film is not far from self-loathing.
You're absolutely right about the film. Just reflecting back on a lifetime of politics, did I ever find the same element of self-loathing? Occasionally, yes, when I was holding my nose and going through the division lobby to support something I didn't really want to do in order to hold the government together and in order to ensure that I could continue to do the good work that I thought I was doing. Yes, there were moments when I was really angry with myself for doing that. It was only occasional. And there do have to be moments when you abandon the desire to play nice and you really do have to, on occasion, take a stand. And the most obvious example of that in my political past was when, having left the government back in 2001, 2 years later, I led the parliamentary opposition to going to war in Iraq. It was really difficult to do. I made myself very unpopular with a lot of former colleagues, but I felt completely passionately that it was the right thing to do. And I went ahead and did it.
Did you find that the idealism and the self-loathing tended to come together in the sense that I think Bill Mackay, the Robert Redford character in this film, and we should be clear as well, we're talking about campaigning, not governing. So there's a whole set of questions that he's going to have to face, and we are only shown the journey. And plot spoiler here, he wins, reader or listener, he wins the journey to office. He's going to be a United States Senator, which is a pretty significant role.
And of course, there is that delicious moment right at the end of the film where he's won and he's desperate to ask his political minder, Marvin Lucas, what do we do now? Because now he's been elected, he has absolutely no idea what is now expected of him.
And yet one feels that he's learned something. And one of the things that he has learned is that the idealism and the self-disgust, they go very closely together. But it's almost like through the film, he loses a kind of control of himself. He's very poised at the beginning of the movie because, so to let people know the setup, a character, Marvin Lucas, the operative, who's identified him as a potential candidate to take on this Republican incumbent and see something in him that he may not have seen in himself. But he has to shake him out of his complacency. He's comfortable at the start of the film. He's got his gorgeous wife, his gorgeous ranch home in California. He's doing good work out in the community. And he's a bit smug. He's quite pleased with himself. And part of his pleasedness with himself is that he feels he's above this stuff. And part of the backdrop to this, the backstory in the film, is he's not been identified by the Democratic Party operative because he's an unknown. He's actually the son of the former governor of California. So he comes from a political dynasty. And it's also clear in the film that a big part of his sense of himself is he's not like his father. So his father, from the first time we hear about him, never mind the first time that we see him, is clearly an old political bastard who's learned every dirty trick in the book. This is a man whose idealism went a long time ago. And his son is resolved not to be like his father. And the other arc of the narrative is the film ends when he's won with his father coming over to him, leaning down and whispering in his ear, "Son, you're a politician now. You are like me." And so there is that sense in the film that he loses his idea of who he was. And as you say at the end, it's not clear he's acquired a new sense of who he is. He feels a bit lost. Would that be fair, that he doesn't come to a sort of Franklin Roosevelt Olympian understanding of this? That's going to take another 50 years in this journey. We see the moment where someone goes into politics and loses their idea of who they are.
I think that's very perceptive as an analysis. The relationship with his father is a theme right the way through the movie. At the outset, he says to everyone, "I do not want my father involved at all in this campaign." By the end, as you say, his father is leaning in and congratulating him on his victory and telling him he's done it by the use of the old political arts. And the way that journey develops, the uneasiness of his first meeting with his father when he's on the campaign trail, the occasional moments immediately after the debate where his father comes in and congratulates him, the moment at the end when he's won and his father appears as well. The way in which that journey of identity with his father happens is, I think, fairly subtly but well done in the movie. And I think you're probably right that what has happened is he's lost his earlier sense of self and he hasn't found a new sense of self yet. But I'm left at the end of the movie with the thought, would I rather have Bill McKay as US Senator than Crocker Jarman, the Republican? The answer undoubtedly is yes, even though his ideals have been corrupted and even though he has lost his sense of self-identity, he's still going to be a better guy to be in there than the oily, greasy, nasty right-wing Republican who's the incumbent.
That bit at the end when his father says to him, "Son, you're a politician now," it did remind me a bit of Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker in the sense that Bill McKay, at the beginning, I think it's fair to say he's more or less estranged from his father, actually. It's not clear whether he's disowned his father or his father has disowned him. And it's clear his father has remarried, so the woman that he meets his father with is not his mother. There is real distance between them. And at one point in the campaign, it seems like his father's going to endorse his opponent. This is a family relationship that's not going well. And he doesn't just say, "Son, you're a politician now." He's effectively saying, "I am your father," in the way that Darth Vader says to Luke Skywalker. And Bill McKay's got a kind of Luke Skywalker feel to him. He's a blonde, good-looking guy who's fighting the good fight, but learning some hard lessons along the way. And it's an electrifying moment, actually, but he looks crushed by it. It's not in the way that Luke Skywalker, it's not good news to hear Darth Vader is his father. This is not a heartwarming reconciliation at the end where the two men come to an understanding there is a family bond which is stronger than anything. This is bad news for Bill Mackay. He is like his father. It's actually pretty bleak.
Bleak, but nonetheless, it is in the context of him having won. So he now has the power and the authority to implement far more than he was able to as a community lawyer. And there is a sense that he is not going to be completely like his father. There's a moment in the film where his father, having congratulated him on the debate, says, now let's all go off and have a meal. And the place where they are going to have the meal, he says, I got him his license, so we're going to get good food there. That sort of sleazy, I'll scratch your back and you'll deliver for me kind of political life, there's never any sense that that's what Bill Mackay is going to do when he gets to the Senate.
And as you say, Senator Crocker-Jarman, who's the incumbent, he's a recognizable type too. And it's quite clear he and Bill Mackay's father have quite a lot in common with each other. They come from that generation. And in some ways, the film is dated. There's a scene where early on in his campaign, he goes to the beach to speak to some hippie-ish young Californians. And there's something very quaintly early 1970s about this scene. It's hard to sort of reconstruct it today. And yet I was really struck by how, in some respects, the arguments between these two candidates are completely familiar in 2024. So the Republican candidate, who's a kind of Nixonian politician, and this is the era of Nixon. This is 1972, so Nixon is dominant. So Nixon is about to win one of the most resounding victories. So this is pre-Watergate. In 72, Nixon is going to crush George McGovern. He's going to crush the Democratic Party. He's going to win an absolute landslide.
It is, of course, pre-Watergate becoming public. But the actions of Watergate happened almost exactly contemporaneously.
Exactly. So it's going on. It's just people aren't aware of it. But Nixonian politics, we did a podcast recently about the idea of the silent majority, which is a phrase that Trump uses, and he borrows it from Richard Nixon. And there are Nixonian aspects to politics now. And in the movie, Bill Mackay is being painted as somehow un-American. He's unpatriotic. The Republican candidate stands for a certain vision of America. But there's also an argument about environmental politics in this film. Actually, that's really a big part of his idealism. He's an idealist about environmental politics. And the Republicans' line, which is a familiar line in 2024, is environmental idealism is all well and good, but we need the oil and we need it to be cheap and we need the gas to be cheap. And he says to his people, his potential voters, that he's the guy who, there is a small environmental disaster.
There's a fire on the watershed, and it's because so many trees have been cut down and they've denuded the canopy. And it's what Bill Mackay had been campaigning on and being a lawyer about right the way through his community activism. And now he goes to the scene of the fire and starts giving interviews, basically saying, this is what we've been talking about all along. And then suddenly Crocker-Jarman, the Republican, helicopters in with smooth words saying he's going to sort it all out and propose a bill in the Senate. And he just completely takes over the narrative at that point.
And that also feels to me like a key moment in the story, because one of the things he says is, I'm the incumbent, this guy's not. This guy's the idealist, but I'm the incumbent. So I can go to Washington and I can get you relief. That's where the money is. And actually, I've been there for a long time, so I'm on the right committees. I'm chairing this committee. And I'll redirect money back here. And you almost catch a look in Robert Redford's eye, which is, I've got to win this thing, right? In the end, to be the outsider is a losing argument in this context. I want to be the one who can say to these people, I'm going to go to Washington and get you what you need. But I'm not going to do it in this cynical way, because Crocker-Jarman also more or less implies, but I'm also going to make sure that I'm not going to fall for any of that green environmental nonsense. This is about money, right? I'm here to represent you, the people of California, and make sure you get, when something goes wrong, you get relief, but you also keep cheap gas, for your cars.
There are some very modern arguments going on in the movie, and it's a little bit depressing in some ways that political debate hasn't moved on in 50 years. The battle between environmentalism and cheap oil, the battle between idealism and the accusation that anyone who is idealistic or on the center left of the political spectrum is somehow un-American. You could listen to Donald Trump talking about Kamala Harris in exactly the same terms that you could listen to Crocker Jarman talking about Bill McKay. And it's really depressing that that sort of argument still gets traction in America.
It's depressing. And also at the same time, I was really taken aback by this in a way that there is a view, and I've sometimes fallen for this myself, that Trump is some kind of outlier in American political history. His like has never been seen before. And you watch this movie from 50 years ago, and some aspects of the Trumpian political style are unfamiliar in this context because Crocker Jarman, he's an establishment figure, so he's not running as an anti-establishment candidate. But the rhetoric, some of the raw rhetoric, some of it is absolutely brutal. It's nasty stuff. It's very familiar, and Trump is not an outlier. This is a story that's been running for a long time. It goes back to Nixon, and it goes back well before Nixon as well. This is a strand of American political life. This kind of nativism, some of it is implicitly racist. It's patriotism co-opted in the cause of painting the other side as borderline traitorous. It's completely familiar.
It is. And there's a moment in the movie after the Robert Redford character, Bill McKay, has made his concluding idealistic remarks in the debate. Crocker Jarman cuts across him and gives this vehement denunciation of what he has just heard. And that could have been pure Trump. And it's nasty, it's vicious, it's condemnatory, it goes beyond rude and dismissive, and it paints an entirely false picture of his opponent.
The film is very good at letting the viewer draw his or her own conclusions about what they've just seen. So there isn't an overlaying explanation of what's worked, what hasn't worked, why is he closing in the polls. It just happens. And the debate is a really interesting example of this. He's given his on-message lines to take, which he's meant to stick to, and he holds to them looking more and more physically uncomfortable, and then he cracks at the end, and he does his impassioned idealistic thing to the horror of his minders who think, oh, he's blown it, the public are going to see him as a sort of hothead and a lefty and all the rest. But he also succeeds in goading his opponent so that his mask falls away too. And this may be the difference between now and then, in that it's very Trumpian, the little speech he does at the end. And there is at least the implication that it's done him a lot of harm. Because after all, he does lose, right? This debate, which from one perspective for his minders has been a bit of a disaster for Bill McKay because he couldn't hold to the message. But he does the thing that can otherwise be very successful in the debate, which is he prods his opponent to the point where his opponent cracks too. And it may be that actually that was the point at which his opponent was on the path to defeat. So that's not Trump, because it may be that 50 years ago, there is a point beyond which, maybe it's California, maybe it's the Times, maybe it was a more conventional age of politics, where that raw, vitriolic, nasty underside of the message alienates more people than it appeals to.
Although, of course, there was a moment this past American presidential campaign, the one debate that Kamala had with Trump, there was a moment when she got under his skin and the mask began to fall a bit. But with Trump, the mask is the candidate, and for some reason or other, large parts of the American electorate like the rhetoric that comes along with that.
In a way, that's the difference. So the two debates look similar, but one results in a defeat, one in a victory. And I think Crocker Jarman's problem relative to Trump is that he is a hypocrite. He is a kind of smarmy, oily candidate who's actually keeping the smooth talk going, trying to keep the nastiness under the surface. So when the nastiness breaks through, there's something repugnant about it. If, like Trump, you're a candidate in which you're not trying to hide that. The thing about Trump, for better or for worse, is that he's not a hypocrite. I've said this before on this podcast. He's many things, but he's not a hypocrite. What you see is what you get. And the reason it's so effective in the film, the goading of the Republican candidate, is it does strip away the mask to reveal something underneath. I think the debate is actually a great scene because it's left very ambivalent at the end as to who's won this thing, actually. And even the operatives are very uncertain at the end as to what they've just seen. He went off message, he disobeyed his orders, but they have a feeling that he might have got away with it.
And of course, the whole thing is completely subsumed by the fact that his father suddenly enters the room at the back of the studio and effectively gives an endorsement for the first time to his son. And that becomes the news story.
I think anyone who sees this film now will inevitably, and I'm going to ask you if it's true of you, but it was certainly true of me, will be reminded in parts of The West Wing. So this is partly simply because Peter Boyle, who plays Marvin Lucas, looks quite a lot like Toby Ziegler, for people who know The West Wing. And he had something of that persona about him too. But it also follows a West Wing plotline, or I should say The West Wing follows the plotline of this movie, which is later on in The West Wing, where the Bradley Whitfield character, Josh Lyman, finally leaves working for Bartlett because he wants to find the next bright hope, the next big thing. And he sort of goes out into the lower rungs of American politics to try and find a young, idealistic candidate that he can mold into a potential presidential candidate. So in that case, the candidate is Matt Santos, Jimmy Smits. People who've seen The West Wing will know exactly what I'm talking about there. And something similar is going on here. And it's not clear how you're meant to think about Marvin Lucas, the operative. It's quite a subtle performance in a way. He's not himself necessarily a cynic. He's doing it because he wants to win. Like all people in politics, he thinks the most important thing is winning. And it did remind me a bit of The West Wing. One of the great things about The West Wing is it was neither a cynical nor a particularly idealistic portrayal of politics. Everybody was complicated and compromised. I mean, obviously you saw it before, so I saw it after I'd seen The West Wing. You originally saw it before you see The West Wing. But do the two speak to you in the same way? Do you think there's a relationship there?
And I saw it long before I saw The West Wing. The one thing I did when the first lockdown hit us and there were these long evenings that you had to spend on your own, and I got myself the box set of the entire West Wing and I watched it all again. And I absolutely loved it. And yes, there are great similarities between The Candidate, the movie, and The West Wing. And the Marvin Lucas character, like the Toby Ziegler and Josh Lyman characters, they are complicated. They are rather good at what they do. And the Marvin Lucas character, the operative in the movie, I find myself wishing that Keir Starmer had someone like that alongside him, helping him with the politics, because that's what Keir Starmer is getting wrong at the moment. But the role of political operative can be a very dirty business. It can also be a very successful and somewhat idealistic business as well. And you need to take all of that in the round and make a judgment as a result. The choice of Matt Santos as the new fresh face and the wish to see him as the next president, and of course in The West Wing he becomes the next president, I just hope that the same sort of search is already underway within the Democrats to find the next big hope who is going to seize power back for sanity and the Democrats in America.
And for the operative, and it may be true of the people who are making the search now, the dilemma in a way is you want a fresh face. You want, I think the unpleasant phrase that people use in politics, someone, a clean skin, as they say, someone who's uncontaminated by what's been going on. And in this film, the great appeal of Bill Mackay, the Robert Redford figure, though he's from a political dynasty, his very outsideriness is part of his appeal. But of course, that makes him harder to manage because he hasn't yet learnt the hard political lessons. Can I ask you about your experience of similar figures? So you were there right at the heart of the New Labour project. You were there through and beyond 1997. Peter Mandelson played a similar sort of role, but there were other figures too, Philip Gould and others. I mean, Blair, if you say Starmer is missing such a figure, Blair was lucky in a way, wasn't he, that he had a number of people who were extraordinarily skilled at that side of politics. Peter Mandelson then went into the other side of politics and was possibly less skilled at that. I think it's possible to say anyone who resigns twice, has got something that they've missed. But my God, he was good at this. And he had a reputation among his opponents as being amoral, Machiavellian and all the rest. But actually, he was quite idealistic, wasn't he?
Yes, up to a point, Lord Cobham.
Tell me the real story.
Peter was very good at reading the politics of the situation and charting a political way forward. Much less good at putting himself into that frame. But as an advisor, as someone thinking about the political implications and likely consequences of decisions, that's where the real skill of a political operative comes. And Tony Blair had quite a lot of people of that kind around him, not just Peter, but Alistair Campbell. And don't ignore the skill with which Jonathan Powell operated as well. And Peter probably thought of himself as being more important than he actually was, but nonetheless was pretty good at reading the political room.
Marvin Lucas, Toby Ziegler and others, the obvious difference is it's very clear they have absolutely no pretensions themselves to be the candidate. It's not just self-knowledge. They look in the mirror and they know, you look at Robert Redford, you look at Marvin Lucas, and Marvin Lucas has no problem saying this guy is the guy I'm running. You don't want to see me on camera. You want to see him on camera. And that's the difference. There's another scene in the film which is both dated and not. So this is 1972. There had come to be an understanding during the 60s in particular. A whole series of books were written about the relationship between politics and advertising. And there had come to be an understanding, and some people thought it was cynical, some people thought it was realistic, that politics and advertising went closely together from the Kennedy era onwards. And the packaging or selling of a politician is a large part of how you win. And the phrase that's sometimes associated with this is retail politics. And there's a scene in a shopping mall where Bill Mackay looks sort of horrified to see himself being paraded in this shopping mall like a product, but he accepts it. But at the same time, when he's railing against it, he's sort of disgusted by the idea that politics has just become like selling this deodorant rather than that deodorant. He sort of captures the bridge between these two eras. People had come to understand that politics is a retail business, and yet the idealism in him is horrified by this.
And there's a particularly lovely scene because in his stump speech, he's giving high-sounding phrases about the richest country in the world, and we can't house all our poor people, and we can't feed all our hungry people, and so on. And then he's sitting in the back of the car going away from a meeting, and he begins to jumble up this word salad in a totally meaningless kind of way. And that is a moment of profound realization about the script that he has to follow and the fact that it teeters on the verge of meaninglessness. But nonetheless, he's exploring both sides of that nightmare. He realizes that there is some meaning to the script, but he also realizes that it's very close to being complete verbiage.
And celebrities play a part. The real Natalie Wood is in the film as Natalie Wood. He's told a Hollywood star is here to meet you. And it does also bridge those eras of American politics in that some of the scenes are really quaint. The dancing girls, the razzmatazz, the balloons, like a political rally from the 19th century almost. And yet this is also the TV age. I want to just take you back to what you said at the beginning, because I was really struck by what you said, that when you first saw the film and then were campaigning in the United States, but thinking of a political career in Britain, there was a difference in that it was clear already by this point that American politics was selling the candidate, personality politics, phrase that's used for it. And yet British politics was still more about arguments about ideas. So when you then embarked on a political career, so take me back to your first campaign. When you first campaigned for Parliament, and you'd seen this movie, did you find yourself thinking, Britain is different? I'm not actually living that experience. Or did you recognize elements of the film and saw that Britain was beginning to move? Your first campaign was 83, is that right?
My very first campaign was in a completely hopeless seat, Epsom and Ewell, in 1979.
That sounds very Tory, Epsom and Ewell, so I'm guessing it was.
It was. It had a 26,000 Tory majority. I kept my deposit. I came second. It was a bracing experience. I can assure anyone that walking down Epsom High Street on a Saturday morning with a red rosette on is an experience only for the brave. But the first real campaign, when I was first elected for Islington South and Finsbury, was 1983. And that was a campaign about ideas and policies and proposals. It wasn't particularly a campaign about personalities. That has gradually changed over the years. And if you think back to historic elections, Clement Attlee, the most successful post-war prime minister we have ever had, there was no cult of personality around Clement Attlee. There certainly was by the time we got to Margaret Thatcher. The contest between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer was perhaps a step backwards in that progress towards personalities. But think of Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, Boris Johnson. These were figures that where a lot of the appeal was about the person rather than just about the ideas and the principles and the ideals. So we are becoming a bit more like America in that respect.
In your campaigns, maybe in 83 or maybe subsequently, were there moments where you found yourself in situations that you reminded you of the film? So, for instance, I assume you did hustings and so on for these. So not the big TV debate, but hustings with your opponent. In 1983, the Labour Party was standing on a pretty left platform. This was Michael Foot, the manifesto that was subsequently called the longest suicide note in history. I don't know where your politics had evolved to at that point, but did you find yourself in that campaign feeling that you had to say things that you weren't comfortable with or that you had compromised on your principles? Or were you at that point simply on a mission to get into Parliament and winning was the job?
There was one aspect of policy at that time that I was deeply uncomfortable about, and that was we were in the Labour Party, unbelievably, with hindsight, campaigning in that election to remove the UK from the European Union. And I was really uncomfortable about that, but that was the party's policy programme. And much against my better judgment, I went along with it. But the party then changed that policy very rapidly after that election.
Did you believe in 1983 there was any chance that the Labour Party would win? Or did you know you were standing to win your seat, but you knew you were standing in a losing cause?
Yeah, we knew we were going to lose. I was pretty determined to win my seat, and I only just managed to do that. My first majority was wafer thin, 363 votes, but I won.
So it really did matter getting out there and talking to voters one by one. You needed to know those 363 people and get them.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Your fellow Islington MP, and the other Islington constituency is Jeremy Corbyn. And of course, in many ways, he's the counter to that narrative that you described from Thatcher to Blair to Johnson. So there are also moments in politics where a kind of, for want of a better phrase, anti-personality candidate, a candidate who very explicitly says, I'm about a set of ideas and not about the way in which you can package me and market me, does come through. You and he were MPs adjoining constituencies, I think, for a long time. How did you see him relative? So we're talking about Britain and America. He's a very distinctive kind of British left, far left then, and in many ways still politician, a successful candidate in Islington. How did you see him in this template of politics moving towards a more packaged version of itself? Presumably, among other things, the idea at that point that he would one day be leader of the party seemed remote.
That was, at that point, incredibly remote. Jeremy is the antithesis of packaged politics. And that's, in a way, why so many young people particularly really warmed to him and voted for him to become leader of the party. And then in 2017, voted in quite substantial numbers for him. There was a sort of an authenticity about him that people liked. His problem, of course, was that he was very much on the extreme of politics. He wasn't fighting for the centre ground, and it remains the centre ground where elections in Britain are won or lost. During the whole of the 22 years that I was the MP for Islington South, Jeremy was the MP for Islington North. We remain good friends. We worked very closely together on local issues. We agreed to disagree about quite a lot of national and international issues because we didn't see eye to eye on everything. And ultimately, that's the decision that the British people took in 2019.
It's funny, as I hear you talking about it, Robert Redford, Bill Mackay in this film is going to become one of the two senators for California. It's quite an unusual relationship, that in a way. Islington as a state, as it were, in this story. And it has its two representatives, you and Jeremy Corbyn. And in American politics, the relationship between the two senators from a given state can be quite fraught, but also they can be quite different. It's not as though each state elects two identikit senators. And it's not clear in this film, I can't now remember whether we hear much about the other senator from California, but Robert Redford's going to be the junior senator. And to become a senator, it's a complicated role, right? You are both a local representative, but it's much more of a national political role than being a member of the House of Representatives. Just to come back to the film to finish, one of the questions I have about it, and I wasn't clear in my own mind when I finished watching it, and I touched on this earlier, is whether or not it is a cynical film about politics. It certainly has cynical moments, but thinking about the context in which it was made, 1972, George McGovern is going to run a relatively idealistic campaign, and he's going to be crushed by a ruthless, wily, and it turns out somewhat corrupt Republican presidential candidate. And the Democratic Party in 1972 was going through one of its phases of high-mindedness, particularly around the Vietnam War, and discovering that high-mindedness doesn't win on the whole. And Robert Redford goes on the journey from high-mindedness to ruthlessness, essentially. And he makes the necessary compromises, including what is perhaps the biggest compromise of all, which is a reconciliation with his father in order to get his father on side. Do you think it's a cynical film? If you can imagine watching it as a young person now, would you say this is a film to draw you into politics or to repulse you? What do you think?
I don't think it's a cynical film. It explores the cynicism that sometimes infects politics, and it looks at that from a whole series of different angles. It shows the erosion of idealism. It shows some of the realities of what is needed in order to win democratic victories. But it doesn't glorify cynicism. I think it analyzes cynicism. And at the end of the movie, you are absolutely delighted that McKay has won over Jarman, because that is going to lead to improvement. And I think I took that message away from the movie when I first saw it. Did it make me want to go into politics? It revealed to me quite a lot about the political process. It didn't put me off going into politics, but it did make me realize that ideals have to be contested always with reality.
The person that you do feel sorry for at the end, certainly I did, is his wife. So there is collateral damage to this. And Robert Redford's an incredibly glamorous figure. He was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, I think. This is the era of The Sting and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and Redford and Newman. And yet it's a very unglamorous film, and it's shot in quite a sort of realistic style, somewhat documentary-ish. So if people see it, it's got that feel of some of the films of the time that were actually documentaries rather than fictionalized accounts. And it's interestingly edited in that many of the scenes just end. They don't have a nice, neat bow tying them off. Stuff happens, and then the next thing happens. So it deglamorizes politics. I think it shows some of the collateral damage. There is a very interesting figure that we haven't mentioned. Early on in the film, we see Bill McKay in his sort of little community lawyer's office, and he has a team of devoted people. He is a very charismatic lawyer. Wherever he goes, he's going to be the center of attention. When Robert Redford walks into the room, doesn't matter what the line of business is, people gather around him like a honeypot. But in this case, the people around him are fellow idealists. And they crop up through the film too, and you can see the disappointment on their faces that he's left them behind to go for this other version of making change in the world. They are collateral damage too, actually.
They are, and there's a moment at the end of the debate, after his father has done his laying on of hands moment. One of the former workers from his team in the community action project, who's been there listening to the debate, comes and looks at him and shakes him by the hand. And there's a look of a mixture of pain and pride on this worker's face, because he's seen both the identikit scripted politician and he's seen the raw idealist at the very end. And there's a look of real pain on Robert Redford's face, because he realizes that he's lost the implicit admiration and trust that his team always used to have in him.
And it's as though they were his family to start with. We see him, as I say, with his wife when the guy comes to try and persuade him to run, and he's pretty skeptical. His wife is quite keen. His wife is a photographer. We see him in this sort of comfortable family setup. But these people are his family too. It's like he has a really tight-knit group of people around him, and they fall away one by one, so that by the end, the key relationships are with the operatives, with his father, a man from whom he's been estranged, a man he clearly, in a sense, doesn't love. He becomes lonelier. That's the other thing that happens to him. He's having what looks like a pretty soulless affair, I think. He's surrounded by beautiful women. They're throwing themselves at him. And it is Robert Redford. If Robert Redford becomes a US senator, that's what's going to happen. And yet there is a loneliness. So that's my last question, really, which is, you've done it, I haven't done it. And you've done it at a high level. You're cabinet minister in a very successful government. Is it a lonely business, politics?
Oh, it's incredibly lonely. You have people around you all the time. But apart from your partner and your immediate family, actually, a lot of these relationships are purely functional relationships, and they exist for the moment when a decision is being made or an office is being held. There's a lot of a real sense of isolation about being in high political office. And it must be even worse for the Prime Minister or the President rather than just a Cabinet Minister. It's bad enough for the Cabinet Minister. It must be even worse for the Prime Minister.
And when you finished after a long, very successful political career, was it a relief or did you quite quickly miss it? Do you miss it now? When you look at Keir Starmer, do you feel the itch?
No, I don't. There are moments when I want to be in there making the decisions or helping to make the decisions and trying to change what is going on. But I don't miss the political process around that.
I'm afraid our special Christmas gift offer is now closed. We're too close to Christmas, but you can still give the gift of a subscription to PPF Plus to anyone you know who you think might like this podcast. Right up until Christmas Eve and beyond, you just need to go to the Join PPF Plus page on our website and click on the gift section or click on the link in the show description. We have a couple of bonus episodes coming up soon, 2 episodes on one film because it's a film that needs 2 episodes to discuss it, Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. But before that, the next episode in our regular slot is going to be about Jeanne Dielman, a film made in 1975 that in 2022 was voted by critics in Sight and Sound the greatest film of all time. And it is the first film that I have discussed so far in this series directed by a woman. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.